In the spring of 1777, a man under a false name slipped through the heavily guarded port of Veracruz, Mexico, a city thick with soldiers, customs officers, and the constant, watchful suspicion that came with guarding an empire's most valuable secret. To any onlookers, he was just another French physician, a quiet traveler interested in local botany. His name was Nicolas Thierry de Menonville, but de Menonville was not a doctor, and he was not there to heal the sick. He was a thief, sent on a highly classified state-sponsored espionage mission by the French crown. His target was not gold, not silver, not military blueprints. He had traveled thousands of miles across the Atlantic, risking a Spanish dungeon, to steal a parasite, specifically the tiny, sluggish insect that lived on the prickly pear cacti of Oaxaca. He knew the Spanish authorities, who fiercely guarded this tiny creature as a crown monopoly, would enforce the absolute law of the empire if he was caught, a law that had already ruined lesser men who'd tried the same gamble before him. But de Menonville kept moving, his eyes fixed on the arid hillsides, searching for a flash of brilliant, impossible crimson. This seemed like a small detail. It was not. To understand why a major European superpower would send a spy to steal a bug, one must understand the desperate, colorless state of the Western world. For centuries, Europe was a continent of muted tones. The wealthy wore silks and wools dyed with muddy ochres, dull yellows, and faded greens, colors that browned and dulled within a year of daily wear, while the ultra-rich could occasionally afford Tyrian purple. That ancient dye had largely vanished, leaving a gaping void in the visual hierarchy of power. The kings, cardinals, and emperors of Europe craved a color that could make them look like gods on earth. A color loud enough to be seen from across a crowded cathedral or a battlefield. They craved red. Not the dull, rusty orange of madder root, the best the local European dyers could manage, and certainly not the pale, unreliable pinks of wild berries. They wanted a red so deep, so brilliant, so permanent, it would command absolute obedience from anyone who looked upon it. For a long time, the closest they could get was a dye called kermes, harvested from oak scales in the Mediterranean. But kermes was weak, expensive, and required millions of insects to produce even a small batch of mediocre scarlet, a dye that faded to a dull brick color within a single season of sunlight. Europe was starving for color, trapped in a visual winter, and then, in 1519, Hernán Cortés and his Spanish conquistadors marched into the heart of the Aztec Empire. When they entered the great market of Tlatelolco in Tenochtitlan, they were blinded by the sheer scale of the wealth on display. Gold, silver, jade, feathers of every exotic bird imaginable. But what caught the eyes of the Spanish merchants more than anything else was a pigment, sold in neat, compressed cakes, or as piles of tiny dried grains. When dissolved in water, it produced a crimson so intense, so blindingly bright, it made the finest European red look like dirty water. The Spaniards had just discovered cochineal. This brilliant dye was the result of centuries of sophisticated Aztec and Mayan agricultural genius. For generations, the indigenous peoples of Mesoamerica had cultivated the nopal cactus, not just for its fruit, but as a host for a tiny scale insect. The female cochineal bug spends its entire life attached to the flat pads of the cactus, sucking its moisture, producing a deep red chemical called carminic acid to protect itself from predators. To the untrained eye, these insects look like nothing more than a white, powdery mold covering the cactus, easy to mistake for disease rather than one of the most valuable substances in the ancient world. The process of harvesting them was slow, meticulous, physically exhausting. Indigenous farmers would stand in the baking sun for hours, using short brushes made of deer hair or feathers, gently sweeping the tiny, delicate insects off the thorny cactus pads and into small baskets, working row after row of nopal until their hands ached and the light began to fade. They had to be extremely careful not to damage the insects or puncture their skins, which would cause the precious pigment to leak out prematurely. Historical Aztec records detail how vassal towns in the hot southern provinces were required to send hundreds of bags of pure, dried cochineal to Tenochtitlan every year as a form of tribute, alongside gold, feathers, and cacao. The indigenous people had developed specialized breeding techniques, selecting the largest, most pigment-rich insects over generations, effectively domesticating a wild parasite into a biological masterpiece. Long before Europeans understood what selective breeding even meant, it took approximately 70,000 dried insects to produce just 1 single pound of cochineal powder, an industry built on micro-details, requiring millions of hours of patient, skilled human labor. For the Aztecs, this pigment was not merely a commodity. It was sacred, used to paint the codices of their gods, decorate the temples of their ancestors, dye the tribute robes of their nobility, a color reserved for the sacred and the powerful, long before any Spaniard ever laid eyes on it. But to the Spanish conquistadors, it was something else entirely. It was a gold mine. As soon as the conquest of Mexico was complete, the Spanish crown realized they had stumbled upon a resource that could rival the silver mines of Potosí, a resource that required no blasting, no smelting, no army of miners dying in underground shafts, just patience, cactus, and an insect nobody outside the Americas had ever seen. They immediately seized control of the entire cochineal industry, establishing an absolute monopoly that would last more than 250 years. No foreigner was allowed to enter the regions where the insect was cultivated. No live insects, no cactus pads were permitted to leave Spanish-controlled territories under penalty of death for anyone caught attempting it. To the rest of Europe, Spain presented a magnificent, infuriating mystery. The dried insects arrived in European ports in sealed, heavy chests, looking like tiny, wrinkled grey seeds. For generations, European scientists, merchants and dyers argued passionately about what cochineal actually was. A seed? A dried berry? A mineral? Some strange exotic worm? Spain happily encouraged this confusion, spreading false rumors to protect their golden goose. They claimed it was a plant seed that could only grow in the unique soil of the New World. A lie repeated so often and so confidently that even trained naturalists in London and Paris found themselves believing it. Meanwhile, the wealth flowing into Spain from this tiny bug was staggering. Cochineal became Europe's most coveted luxury pigment, second only to silver in the imperial treasury's export ledger. These galleons were heavily guarded. Pirates quickly learned that capturing a single cargo ship loaded with cochineal could make a crew rich for life, and stories of such captures spread through every port from Cadiz to the Caribbean. The Catholic Church adopted it to dye the robes of its cardinals. The kings of France, England, and Sweden wore cloaks of Spanish red to assert their sovereignty. Even the British Army, seeking a uniform that would make their soldiers look imposing and unified on the battlefield, chose cochineal to dye the wool coats of their officers, creating the legendary redcoats. However, the true potential of cochineal in Europe was unlocked by an accidental breakthrough in the early 17th century. A Dutch inventor named Cornelius Drebbel was working in his laboratory in London when he made a startling discovery. He was experimenting with a thermometer using a solution of cochineal. When he accidentally spilled some of the red liquid, it ran down a window frame, where it mixed with a container of aqua regia, a highly corrosive mixture used to dissolve tin. Sitting there for some entirely unrelated experiment he'd been running that same afternoon. To Drebbel's astonishment, where the cochineal met the dissolved tin, the liquid did not turn into the typical dark crimson. Instead, it transformed into a blindingly bright, vivid, fiery scarlet, a color far more brilliant than anything Europe had ever witnessed. Drebbel had discovered the chemical secret of the mordant, a discovery he made purely by accident, cleaning up a spill he never intended to make, the kind of accident that history would later repeat, almost exactly with a teenager and a beaker 2 centuries on. Soon, the French King Louis XIV heard of this magnificent color and hired Drebel's descendants to work at the state-sponsored Gobelins works in Paris. The royal robes, tapestries and uniforms of the French court were soon drenched in this new Gobelin scarlet, a color so tightly associated with the crown that ordinary weavers were forbidden from replicating it. The demand for Spanish cochineal reached a fever pitch. Spain raised the prices, and the rest of Europe was forced to pay astronomical sums to drape themselves in this newly perfected red. While European kings paid fortunes for the dye, scientists back home were still desperately trying to figure out what it actually was. The mystery was finally shattered in 1685 by a Dutch microscope pioneer named Antony van Leeuwenhoek, a man better known for being the first human being to ever observe bacteria under a lens of his own grinding, using his handcrafted microscopes. He examined the dried cochineal grains in meticulous detail. He dissected the tiny shriveled specimens and discovered the unmistakable structures of insect anatomy: legs, antennae, internal eggs, proof that no botanist in Europe could argue against. He had proven that Spain's legendary red dye was not a botanical seed, but a tiny parasitic insect. This revelation sent shockwaves through the scientific and merchant communities of Europe. If it was a biological organism, it could be stolen, transported, cultivated elsewhere. The race was officially on. This absolute monopoly bred intense jealousy among Spain's rivals. The British, the French, and the Dutch watched with gritted teeth as Spanish galleons sailed across the Atlantic, laden with chests of dried insects sold in London, Paris, and Amsterdam for their weight in silver, enriching a crown that seemed to have found a source of wealth, requiring no army to defend, only a wall of secrecy. Foreign governments began hiring botanists, merchants, and mercenaries to crack the Spanish code. This was the birth of botanical espionage. A high-stakes shadow war fought not with soldiers and cannons, but with brushes, baskets, and men willing to risk everything for a plant that fit in the palm of a hand. In the remote valleys of Mexico and the royal courts of Europe, the British East India Company made several desperate attempts to break the monopoly, sending agents to smuggle live cacti and insects out of Central America, hoping to establish rival plantations far from Spanish reach. But their espionage attempts were plagued by a lack of botanical understanding. The kind of mistake that looks obvious in hindsight, but was nearly invisible to men who had never seen a live cochineal insect in their lives. In their haste, British agents smuggled the wrong species entirely, a wild, non-commercial cousin of the real insect, one that looked identical to an untrained eye, but produced almost none of the prized pigment. When introduced to India, it multiplied rapidly, but produced a pale, useless dye. Worse, it began destroying local agriculture, turning the grand imperial experiment into a costly ecological disaster that took decades to fully undo. Spain's secret remained safe, protected as much by biological complexity as by armed guards. This brings us back to de Menonville. His mission was the climax of this century-long struggle, the culmination of decades of failed attempts by rival empires. He dressed as a simple traveler, claiming to search for local plants to cure a fictional illness, a cover story thin enough that any suspicious official could have unraveled it with a single hard question. He traveled on foot and by mule through the rugged mountains of Oaxaca, sleeping in whatever shelter he could find, always watching the road behind him for signs he was being followed. Finally, in a quiet, secluded valley, he saw them, rows of cultivated nopal cacti, covered in the telltale white powdery coating of the live cochineal insects. He had found the secret treasury of Spain. Working quickly under the cover of night, he used a delicate brush to harvest live female insects and carefully cut off several pads of the nopal cactus. Wrapping each one with the same care a jeweler might give a stone, he packed them into specially designed wooden boxes, padded with dry straw to keep the insects alive during the long journey home.
I do not recognize this.
Every checkpoint was a terrifying gamble, but through a combination of bribes, forged papers, and sheer luck, he reached the coast, boarded a French vessel, and escaped. successfully smuggling the live insects and their host plants to the French colony of Saint-Domingue. Modern-day Haiti, for a brief moment, the French crown believed they had broken the Spanish monopoly. The 2.5 centuries of Spanish dominance had finally come to an end. But nature has a way of resisting human greed. The climate of Saint-Domingue was not quite the same as the high, arid valleys of Oaxaca. A series of unexpected frosts, combined with the Menonville's sudden, untimely death from a tropical fever just a few years later, caused the plantation to collapse. The smuggled insects died out. Spain's secret remained secure, but Spain's monopoly could not last forever. The end did not come from a foreign spy. After all the money and all the risk poured into stealing it, it came from the unstoppable march of science. For nearly 300 years, Cochineal Red reigned supreme. Then, in 1856, an 18-year-old British chemistry student named William Henry Perkin was working in a makeshift laboratory in London, trying to synthesize quinine to treat malaria, a cure the British Empire desperately needed for its soldiers stationed across the tropics. Instead, he ended up with a dark, sludge-like residue at the bottom of his beaker. When dissolved in alcohol, it produced an incredibly intense, beautiful purple. Perkin had accidentally created Movine, the world's first synthetic dye. This accidental breakthrough shattered the old world of natural color. Dyes no longer needed to be painstakingly harvested from millions of dried insects, rare plants, or expensive sea snails. They could be mass-produced in massive chemical factories using coal tar, a cheap, abundant byproduct of the gas lighting industry that had been sitting around London gasworks with no real use until Perkin's beaker changed everything. The demand for natural cochineal plummeted almost overnight. The cactus plantations of Oaxaca were abandoned. The once glorious scarlet coat of the British officer became a relic of a bygone era. The color of kings had been democratized, turned into a cheap industrial commodity anyone could buy for a few pennies. Yet this is not where the story of red ends. In a strange, ironic twist, the very chemical revolution that destroyed the cochineal industry has recently brought it back. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, scientists began to uncover the dark side of synthetic dyes, several linked to hyperactivity and other health concerns, prompting parents, regulators, and food companies alike to start reading ingredient labels far more carefully than they ever had before. As consumers began demanding natural alternatives, the world turned its eyes back to the past. Back to the same insect the Aztecs had been farming 5 centuries earlier. Today, if you look at the ingredient list on a bottle of strawberry milk, a red velvet cake, a lipstick, or a cup of fruit yogurt, you'll often see a harmless-looking ingredient listed as carmine, cochineal extract, or E120. It is the exact same pigment harvested by the Aztecs 500 years ago. Millions of cochineal insects are still hand-harvested from cacti in Peru, Mexico, and the Canary Islands to satisfy our modern craving for a natural, safe red, using techniques barely different from the ones farmers used long before Cortés ever set foot on the continent. We have returned to the ancient bug, admitting that our most advanced chemical laboratories still cannot quite replicate the perfect, brilliant crimson designed by nature, the color of power and prestige. Once guarded by the threat of death, is now swirling at the bottom of a morning coffee cup, unnoticed, unremarkable, and utterly ordinary. Ultimately, the history of red is a mirror of human nature. A story of how far we are willing to go, how much we are willing to risk, just to drape ourselves in an illusion of superiority. We fought wars, sent spies across oceans, and built entire colonial empires on the backs of tiny dried insects, all to signal to the world that we were different, that we were elite, that the color on our backs meant something the color on someone else's did not. But as we look at the red in our cups and on our lips today, mixed in without a second thought by a machine that has no idea what it's really pouring, we are reminded of a simple, humbling truth. No matter how high we build our empires, The symbols of our ultimate power have always been borrowed from the humblest creatures beneath our feet. As we close this chapter on the color of kings, we look ahead to a different kind of survival, one that had nothing to do with looking powerful and everything to do with staying alive. In our next video, we explore what happened when the world's most glorious militaries had to swallow their pride, dip their uniforms in mud and tea, and invent a color of survival that would change the face of warfare forever. Join us next time as we uncover the gritty, hidden history of khaki.